Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Back to Ashes. I am your host, Phoenix. I would like to take a moment and acknowledge the elite members of Back to Ashes. Thank you so much for your continuous, dedicated support. You have my deepest gratitude. If you like the way these stories are narrated, please show some love by giving a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, share, or you can check the description box and buy me a coffee. Without further ado, it is time to jump into today's stories. I will go ahead and mention I'm going to kick it off with a true crime story that happened on Valentine's Day. And after that, it will be regular stories. So, sit back, relax, kick back, grab a snack or tuck in and get warm, and prepare for your dose of vocal melatonin entitled True Valentine's Horror Stories. Right after this intro, there will be an ad. I'll read the first story, there will be an ad. And after that, there will be no more ads within this video. Disclaimer, this video is for educational and entertainment purposes. Michigan and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre is a particularly bloody chapter in organized crime history. On Valentine's Day 1929, Thompson submachine gunshots and murdered 7 men from Chicago's North Side gang, headed by George Clarence Bugs Moran. Though the perpetrators of the massacre officially remain unidentified, many believe the members of Al Capone's South Side gang are the culprits. One man in particular suspiciously fled the scene to St. Joseph, Michigan, with violent consequences. A local murder. Some 10 months after the massacre, St. Joseph officer Charles Skelly intervened in a skirmish involving a drunk driver hitting another car. After Skelly ordered the participants to the police station, the drunk man jumped into his car and sped away. Officer Skelly immediately gave chase, hopping onto another car's running board. After catching up, Skelly leaped onto the running board of the fleeing car. The driver picked up a revolver and shot 3 bullets into Skelly's torso, knocking him to the ground. He died in the hospital later that night. Charles Skelly is the only St. Joseph police officer to have been killed in the line of duty. Registration papers in the shooter's later discarded car identified Fred Dane as the owner. Officers found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence in a raid of Dane's abandoned house. Rifles, ammunition, bulletproof vests, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen bonds. Fingerprint analysis identified that Fred Dane was actually Fred Burke, a notorious robber and gunman, close associate of Al Capone, and major suspect in the St. Valentine's Day shootings. A career criminal. Fred Burke made a career out of being a criminal. Born in Kansas and active of many years in St. Louis, Missouri, with a gang called Egan's Rats, Burke quickly moved up the ranks of organized crime. He eventually caught the attention of Al Capone, who hired him in the 1920s. His crimes spanned multiple states, including Michigan, and he left a slew of robberies and murders in his wake. Burke's criminal record and his close association with Capone made him one of the likely gunmen who murdered Maroon's men. After his purported involvement with the massacre, Burke fled across the lake to St. Joseph, where he established a life under the alias Fred Dane, one of the many he used throughout his career. It was during one drunken night that he shot and killed Officer Skelly. The capture. After being forced to flee once again, police finally apprehended Burke almost a year later at a farm in Missouri, where he was living under the name Richard Franklin White. Chicago and Michigan officials volleyed for the right to claim Burke. Chicago for the massacre and Michigan for the murder of Skelly. The governor of Missouri determined that Michigan had the more solid claim and Burke was extradited to Michigan to be tried. The St. Joseph murder was not Fred Burke's first run-in with the Michigan law. He served a 1-year stint in Jackson Prison, then the state prison of South Michigan, in 1919 when he was just 25 years old. The Detroit Recorder's Court convicted and sentenced for the offense of obtaining money under false pretenses. This time, he would not get off so lightly. The Berrien County Circuit Court sentenced Burke to life in prison for second-degree murder on April 27, 1931. Records indicate that he arrived at the state prison in Marquette the next day, registered under the name Fred Dane. The most dangerous man in America. The celebrities surrounding the outlaw and the sensationalism of the case made it regular front-page news for over a month in Benton Harbor's The News Palladium, now the Herald Palladium. The newspaper treated readers to detailed coverage of Burke's actions, from his capture in Missouri to his first days in Marquette prison. Daily reports particularly enjoyed graphic depictions of Burke's many crimes. The coverage cultivated Berrien County's clear sense of pride in harboring the famous fugitive. The newspaper often deemed him the most dangerous man in America. Burke remained at Marquette until he died of a heart attack on July 10, 1940, at the age of 47. He never admitted to an involvement in the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Valentine's Day is a time of love and showing emotion and gratitude to that very special person in your life. 4 years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to go out for Valentine's Day. Where we live, it is still fairly warm in February, so I decided to take my girlfriend on a picnic that we had been planning for about a week or so. My girlfriend and I love being outdoors, and I figured after the picnic, perhaps we could walk on a trail or perhaps take a quick hike. About a month ago, while I was hiking, I found this amazing spot where I thought we could have the picnic. From one of the main trails, it only took about 15 minutes to walk there, and it wasn't that hard of a walk either. You did have to go off of one of the main trails around a semi-narrow bend and leading to a small rock formation. The area overlooked our hometown. It was a beautiful view and a flat land where we could sit and have a really nice picnic. I set up an entire area for us, chairs, tables, and a bunch of her favorite snack foods. On the rear side of the spot were more woods, and even in the daylight, there were so many trees back there that it seemed dark. So, when Valentine's Day finally came, we set off for our adventure. Thankfully, it was a beautiful sunny day. It was warm with a nice breeze and not a cloud in the sky. We held hands on the trail until we got to the spot where I went off the trail. I told her to trust me as we went off the path. She was hesitant, but was down for the journey. Just as I expected, the short trip was easy for her. We reached the spot in no time, and she was blown away. She just stopped and stared out at the horizon in awe. When she saw the spread of food I had, she was even more blown away. Today could not have gone any better. And almost in a blink of an eye, that changed. While we were laughing and staring at the beautiful view, she stopped suddenly. I asked her what was wrong, and she said she had heard something in the woods. I looked around in the dark trees, but saw nothing. I told her she was crazy, just kidding around, obviously, and tried to go back to flirting with her, but she wasn't having it. She insisted that I check out the woods. Oh, annoyed more than anything, I told her I would. I got right up to where the tree line started, and I peeked through the almost endless amount of trees. I saw nothing. If I'm being honest, I had a really hard time making out anything in there, but I truly did not see anything. She approached after a minute or two and said in a terrified voice, "Right there. You don't see that shape? It looks like a person." I squinted and tried to make out the shape. It just looked like a shadow to me. "Babe, I think that's just a shadow," I responded in an almost condescending voice. She was hysterical and added me to please look at it. So I stepped into the dark forest, and to my absolute fear, the dark figure moved. It was very slight, almost like a shoulder shrug, but I saw it. At that moment, I felt intense anxiety and fear, but I didn't want to freak out my girlfriend, or even worse, alert this potentially dangerous person that I knew they were there. After only a couple of steps, I told my girlfriend I needed something, and I turned back to where we were sitting. I grabbed my girlfriend and I tried to tell her not to freak out, but that I did in fact see a person in the trees. She was crying hysterically, and I was just trying to think of the best way to get out fast. I looked down over the lookout, but it was just too steep. The only way was the way we came, which was fine, but I just didn't want this lunatic to follow us. I decided to leave all the stuff behind and start walking down the rock formation. She went down first as I stared into the trees, and that's when I saw it clear as day. This shadow figure was definitely a man, and he was approaching us now. He was only about 45 or 50 feet away. I couldn't make out any specific details, but it looked like he had a beard. I finally started going down the rock formation, and I told my girlfriend to run as fast as she could. We made it to the trail quickly. As we stopped to catch our breath, we heard the rustling of the trees and the crack of the sticks. This man was chasing us. She pulled out her phone to call the police, but apparently she didn't have a signal. Of course. We finally reached the parking lot of the park trails, and there were 2 police cars. The police were already looking for someone. Apparently, there was a woman jogging the trails early in the morning and found a man laying off on the side of the trails. She called the authorities right away, and the man reported being mugged and robbed. We told the cops everything, but by the time they got into the woods, they couldn't find the man. From what I understand, they never caught this crazy person in the woods, and I'm not sure what he would have done if he actually caught us. I still can't believe my girlfriend spotted him from so far away, and I'm so thankful she did. We both have a really hard time going on nature trails now, and I still have yet to return to that park. From now on, we decide it's best to just stay indoors, especially for Valentine's Day. I went to high school in the early 2000s, specifically from 2003 to 2007. I was stalked and abducted by a classmate for years. I was in band, choir, and theater as well, so I was not popular by any means. I had a fair amount of friends, and high school was fun for the most part. I live in a small coastal town in Mississippi, so it's important to know that everyone pretty much knows everyone else here. Enough of that, though. Let's get to the actual story. As I mentioned, living in South Mississippi, everyone knows each other. I wasn't too popular in high school, but I had this weird way of attracting the oddest people. However, I'm not talking about goth or emo kids. I mean those that are genuinely weird, the kind of people that gave off a really creepy vibe. I didn't think much of it at the time because in my young high school mind, I assumed they were just misunderstood. One guy I met at school, let's just call him Chip, turned out to be more of a creep than I initially thought. He would follow me around school, talking to me about random things. He was into the card game, Magic the Gathering, and would try to explain it to me in great detail, despite my obvious disinterest. I would politely tell him I wasn't interested and walk to my class, but he made it to a point to wait for me after each class and walk with me everywhere. He was a loner, and I was starting to understand why. I figured he talked to me because I didn't tell him to screw off. My friends would tease me, saying he was just stalking me. I would laugh it off, saying he was just a weird guy who didn't know any better. To give a little backstory, I was pretty awkward looking in my freshman and part of my sophomore year. I'm tall, 5 feet 9 inches to be exact, and at the same time, I was going through growth spurts. I was super skinny and had breasts way too big for my tiny frame. I hadn't grown into myself just yet. But back to the story. Every day, Chip would tell me I was the most beautiful person he had ever seen and that he wanted to be with me. I wasn't allowed to date at the time, so I would tell him my parents didn't allow it. He told me he would wait for me and that one day we would be together. I just brushed it off, not thinking anything of it. The escalation. Fast forward to my junior year. I had finally filled out. I was still slender, but I was getting some curves and my breasts looked much more proportional. One day, I was driving home from school with my little sister in my truck, a 1997 Ford Ranger XLT. I was turning off the road my school was on when I noticed an old Chevy following me. I didn't think much of it at first, because several classmates lived nearby. There were a couple of main roads in my hometown. Highway O, which is the beach highway, and Railroad, which runs parallel to it. As we drove down Railroad towards our street, the old Chevy got closer to us. It freaked my sister out, but I assured her it was nothing to worry about. We pulled onto our street and into our driveway, and the truck passed us. My sister and I shook it off and went inside. A few days later, as we were pulling into our driveway after school, I saw Chip sitting on our front doorstep. He smiled at us and waved at me. My mom worked in the morning as a preschool teacher, so she was already home. She gave me a stern look and asked why he was sitting on our front doorstep. I told her about how he followed me around at school and talked to me because he didn't have many friends. She told me he was not allowed to come back to the house and that I needed to ask him to leave. I walked outside and told Chip he needed to leave and that my mom said he was not allowed to come back. He smiled and said okay, and then walked away. From that moment on, I got a really creepy feeling about him. As usual, he continued following me around school every day. The workplace incident. By my senior year, I had gotten a job at the same preschool where my mom worked. One day, while at work, I looked out of my classroom window and noticed the old Chevy truck parked in the lot right next to my truck. That same sick feeling washed over me. I shook it off because I had a classroom full of kids. A few days later, there was a knock on my classroom door. The preschool was set up in trailers with a large outside deck connecting the classrooms. My mom and the director were standing outside, looking upset. I stepped out, and my mom told me Chip was there looking for me. When I stepped onto the deck where he stood, he approached me like he was going to hug me. I backed away, holding my hands out in front of me. He looked hurt. "I've been waiting for you," he said. I asked him, "For what?" He told me I was more than old enough to date now, and he felt it was time we started. I told him he was crazy and that I would never date him. I went off telling him in so many words to screw off and never come near me again. His face twisted from pleading to anger when I didn't apologize, but I stood my ground and he finally left. That was a huge mistake. I broke down crying. The abduction. Years passed. I graduated from high school and junior college and started my first year at a 4-year university. I was working for an HVAC company as an office manager. One day, I heard the door open while working in QuickBooks. Without looking up, I said, "I'll be with you in a moment." When I finally looked up, the blood drained from my face. It was Chip. He just stood there smiling. "I'm still waiting for you." I froze. Suddenly, everything went black. I woke up in the middle of an abandoned park. It had once been popular, but the owner had passed, and it was left to decay. I realized I was tied to an old swing set pole. In the darkness, I saw something move. It was Chip. "I waited for you," he whispered. Panic surged through me. But I noticed something. The pole I was tied to wiggled. I pulled it from the ground, adjusted my arms, and swung. The pole cracked against his head, and he hit the ground with a thud. I ran. I found his truck on the side of the road, saw my purse inside, and grabbed an old pocket knife. I cut myself free, started the truck, and peeled out. I drove straight to the police station. Chip had disappeared before the cops arrived. The aftermath. Months later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a small piece of paper. "I'll be waiting for you." The stalking did not stop. Years later, he showed up again, lurking outside my home. My husband and I called the police. He was arrested. At his trial, his lawyer pleaded insanity. But I knew better. I don't know what will happen next, but I do know one thing. I will never stop looking over my shoulder. A little background. The events of this story took place when I was 21 years old. I am a guy, and have always been somewhat awkward. I was never in the popular crowd and never really found my clique in high school. I've always been pretty nervous at talking to girls and or asking them out. It's not that I'm overly nervous, really. It's just I never really know the right thing to say or how to carry on the conversation. I have a twin sister who is the exact opposite. She was always popular, had tons of friends, and was usually in a steady relationship. She was a bit of a social butterfly, and we used to joke around about how different we were from one another. It never bothered me, and in fact, some of my fondest memories of my childhood was goofing around and poking fun at each other with my sister. Fast forward to when I was 21, right around Valentine's Day. I'm not sure if it was the constant cold weather or the fact that my sister was hanging out with her boyfriend, but I was feeling especially lonely. I asked my sister if she would help me set up a dating profile on one of the 1,000 dating websites that there are out there. We went through all of the criteria and gave it a few days to see if I got any responses. I received a few messages, but the conversations fizzled after a few exchanges back and forth. The day before Valentine's Day, I received a message from a girl who is extremely attractive and who wouldn't give me the time of day in high school. Her name was Gwen, which I very much liked because it reminded me of Gwen Stacy from the Spider-Man comics. She made talking very easy, which was awesome because I was never good at steering conversations. She laughed at my dry sense of humor and always kept the conversation going. Thinking she was possibly not who she said she was, or perhaps a catfish, I asked her to video chat with me, and she complied. I was shocked when it was really her. I couldn't believe it. We talked about a lot of things, the things you ask someone when you're getting to know them and clearly interested in. She eventually told me that I was one of the nicest people she had ever spoke to, and that I was different than the other guys she talked to or been with in the past. We eventually set up a plan for a date and to meet in person. When the day came, I picked her up, but not from her house. She said she had to work and I could pick her up downtown. I didn't think anything of it, so it didn't set off any red flags. We had a few drinks and then went to dinner. We had plans to go to the movie after dinner, but as I was paying the check, she said, "Let's go on an adventure." Confused by what that meant, I asked her to clarify. She said it in the bubbly voice I grew so accustomed and comfortable with. "Let's go to Blue Lakes. They have the trails there, and the moonlight will be on the lake. It'll be super romantic and way better than any movie. Nervous but excited, I said yes, of course. But in my own mind, I liked the idea of the movies because I didn't have to worry about what to say and carrying on a conversation. We drove to Blue Lakes, which is the name of this beautiful park in my hometown. It's not actually called Blue Lakes, but because the lake has a deep blue color, everybody in the town just calls it Blue Lakes. We got there at about 10 p.m., and I was starting to get nervous and felt like I was somehow going to mess things up. I texted my sister and told her where I was and asked her to give me some kind of advice on what to do or what to say. She didn't respond right away. Thanks, sis. There was a couple of cars in the parking lot, which was weird for that time of night, but I was trying to have fun. She said, "Oh, don't be nervous about the cars. It's probably just some couples still celebrating Valentine's Day." She grabbed my hand and started walking towards one of the trails. She could have said anything at this point, and I would have went along with her. She let go of my hand and walked up to the trail beside the lake. She said very loudly, "Wow, look how beautiful this place is." I thought it was kind of weird how loud she said it, but again, I really didn't care. While she was staring at the water, I checked my phone to see if my sister texted me back, and she did. She just said, "Get out of there now." Thoroughly freaked out, and truly not sure why, I looked up at my phone for Gwen was standing right there with a smile on her face. "What's wrong, Andrew?" she said in a soft voice. I tried, but I couldn't answer. I had 100 things running through my head right now. She said in a flirtatious voice, "Don't you want to kiss me, Andrew?" I finally had the courage to respond and said, "I need to leave." Gwen laughed at me and said, "Aw, don't be shy, Andrew. We just got here." I turned around and tried to walk off the trail, and there were two guys standing there. I was frozen in fear, not sure why they weren't moving out of the way. Gwen came up behind me and whispered in my ear, "Andrew, we're not leaving yet. My friends just got here." I tried to run, but two more guys ran from the other side and tackled me. I'm a pretty big guy, but I couldn't hold my own against four guys. They held me down, taking turns punching and kicking me. It hurt, but the adrenaline from being scared kept me from being in intense pain. They tied me to a tree, stole my wallet, took my car keys, and hit me a couple more times before leaving. Gwen took my phone and threw it in the lake. Within minutes of being there tied to a tree, I saw flashing lights turn into the park. I screamed for help, and the police found me tied to the tree. They helped me down and began questioning me when my sister arrived. Apparently, as soon as I texted her, she called the cops and rushed over here herself. She was at a party, and a group of guys were there saying they were going to jump some loser at Blue Lakes. They had an entire plan to rob him and beat him up and leave him there. My sister told them they were lame and jerks and walked away, not really thinking about it until a couple of hours later when I texted her. Not taking any chances, she called the police. They were able to find one of the four guys, but the other three they couldn't find. And they also couldn't find Gwen. All of her information online was fake, so they couldn't track her. My car had some minor damage and looked to have been used for drug usage. I only had minor injuries, including a concussion, a badly scraped arm, and some soreness from where I'd been kicked. The thing that still haunts me and bothers me to this day is the motivation for this event. Was it really worth all the effort to eat a broke college kid's wallet and his car? I had maybe a couple $100 on me, and I canceled my credit card immediately. It just seemed like a lot of time for a small payoff. 4 years later, and I still have nightmares of that night. Even though the incident could have been worse, I still have mental scars from getting attacked by a group of strangers. I have since found an amazing girlfriend and no longer live in my hometown. Hopefully, since this story, dating websites have made an effort to authenticate their users, and things like this don't ever happen again. In the mid 1990s, I was a young college student somewhere in the Midwest. It was my first year attending, and I fell in love with the idea of the whole college experience. I leaned into any kind of stereotype that I could think of. I tried to date a lot, went to as many parties as I could, and always said yes to drugs and alcohol. I was searching for that quintessential university experience. I wasn't attending a university, but it was a mid-sized community college that had a large student body. I lived a couple of towns over in a smaller, more rural community. Because of the distance, I had no interest in making a daily commute. This led me to the logical conclusion to pay for a dorm my first semester, like many freshman students, and really get my college legs underneath me, so to speak. Moving into the dorms was my first time moving anywhere, so it was kind of like being on my own, or having my own apartment or something like that. It was exciting and new to me. As I explained earlier, I was leaning into my college experience hard. That being said, I was a close-cased homebody. I didn't have a lot of friends. My high school experience hadn't really set me up for the college encounters I was hoping for. There was nothing to be done about it. No quick correction to make me popular or anything of the such. Hence why I was a yes man and just tried to show up for as many parties and events as I could. College was cool, and so was the dorm. It was a 70s style brick building, really blocky with 3 floors and long narrow hallways. I don't remember how many rooms or students fit in the building, but I would guess somewhere in the ballpark of around 60 residents. We lived in Whitney Commons. That was the name of the dormitory. I believe Whitney was the last name of a prior professor, or maybe even one of the investors, some bigwig in college history. To me, at the time, Whitney Commons sounded like a bad apartment or some kind of fancy complex name. Most of the rooms were identical, outfitted to sleep 2 students with room for study and relaxation. I'd say the rooms were about 10 by 15, maybe a little bigger, just enough for 2 single beds that stood tall, fitting a sliding desk beneath them, a closet, a chest for storage, and a sink in the corner with a small separator to change clothes behind. Some of the other rooms were a little bigger and set up to sleep 3. Each level had a shared bathroom with showers and all of that. I got a corner unit on the far side of the first floor. To me, it was perfect, easy to find, no stairs to move in, and I got a rolling view of the complex. Because I was one of the few rooms that actually had 2 windows, it was nowhere near as cool as I'm making it out to be, but it was my first experience away from home, and I loved it. The guy I was rooming with seemed cool. He also lived in a rural township and decided staying on campus would save him a lot of time as well. I only spoke to him 2 or 3 times before he withdrew from all of his classes and ended up moving back home. I don't even think he made it through the first week of classes. For whatever reason, he went home, and no one else enrolling in school chose to stay on campus the rest of that semester. Somehow I looked out and became the only guy not to have to share a dorm room. This made me somewhat popular with other people in the building because my unit was considered a potential party unit. This never really came to fruition, though. School was trickling by, and like everyone else, I became buried under classwork. What little time I had left at the end of the day, I spent relaxing, wandering around campus or exploring other buildings. I found that when you lived on campus, sometimes buildings wouldn't be locked. We kind of had full 24-hour access to most of the school property. One day I heard something that would capture my interest for months. I was sitting in my dorm studying, and I heard the voice of a woman, high-pitched, playful, unmistakable. Because I don't have a roommate, I typically left my door wide open so I could hear banter with anyone walking by. It was like an open invitation for people to bug me, although not many ever did. The Whitney building was entirely male, as most dorms are. The female dorms were newer buildings nestled together across campus, closer to the academic buildings. Whitney was a bit of an outlying building, literally on the edge of campus, isolated by 3 massive parking lots. The closest building was the gymnasium dome, which had a big parking lot to isolate it, and didn't get used a whole lot, aside from weightlifting classes. Since we were a mid-sized community college, we weren't really known for our sports teams. What I'm getting at is our dorm building didn't get a lot of visitors. We were used to seeing the same people, the same cars in our parking lot. If the maintenance man paid us a visit, we would all know about it in a second. Heavier footfalls, different voices. We all grew accustomed to our neighbors and what to expect. So, when I heard this female voice in the afternoon, I didn't really know what to make of it. You probably don't really need me to tell you what I did next. I listened. I leaned back at my desk, homework scattered in front of me. I let it all go. Story 1. Embrace this new distraction, whoever she was. She was hanging out with one of the guys in the room right next door to mine. I don't know either of the guys that stayed there. I'd seen them with a textbook and only ran into them during certain hours in certain areas of campus. From this, I gleaned that one of them was on a vocational program, like welding or something. Whatever the case, Welder Man had scored a lady to bring home. This was the first semester, so it was the first interaction like this to happen in our dorm. At least to my knowledge. I couldn't help myself. I closed my door and moved my desk chair over to the opposite wall so I could listen. They just talked at first. At length, too. They went back and forth for like 3 hours talking, sharing, joking, laughing, even whispering. I know it all sounds creepy, but this is an anonymous story, which almost makes it a confession. So, I'll say it was exciting to eavesdrop on them. It became my new favorite hobby for the rest of the school year. I wasn't alone. The guys who stayed on the other side of the dorm were just as enthralled. We actually became buddies over our shared enjoyment of listening in. We'd high-five in the hallways, talk after class, compare notes on different things that we were hearing, and discuss what the girl looked like. The guy in the dorm room in question quickly became a small celebrity on campus, at least for the Whitney building. He'd take requests for people in the building, like what sounds we wanted to hear, words to be said, things like that. It was almost like we were making our own interactive porno. The guy in the room, we'll just call him Hank, absolutely loved the attention. As the school year went on, Valentine's Day was just around the corner. Mike, Tim, and I got pretty excited at the prospect. What could possibly happen on the lovers' holiday? We joked about getting popcorn, drilling a peephole, all kinds of weird and creepy stuff. I know you can imagine our disappointment when we realized that, for whatever reason, we had a long holiday weekend that week. Between the bad weather and the extra days off from class, most of the student body and faculty were dismissed from campus. What that meant was most people went home. The Whitney building was a ghost town, especially for those who stayed behind. In all of the Whitney building, it was just me and one of the guys from the other room, Tim. Tim and I shacked up in my room, played cards, listened to music, watched movies. It was very bachelor-style living, eating everything out of fast food bags, being loud and not showering. That was until we heard someone come through the front door of the main room. Only someone with a key can open up the Whitney building, so that meant a student or a staff member. No outside visitors unless we opened the front door for them. Tim and I quietly stared at one another, waiting to hear who it was. We were a little creeped out, almost like we'd been caught doing something wrong. So We stayed totally silent. The reality was we didn't have any drugs or anything, so we were unclear. We just listened as they came down the hall, not up the stairs either. Someone who lived in our wing or someone coming to check on us. Maybe a janitor had seen the light through the blinds of my window and was coming to turn it off. Our eyebrows raised and our breath hitched when we heard footsteps stop in front of the room right next door. It was the hometown hero, and as we listened, we could actually hear the pitter-patter of 2 sets of feet. It was the guy and his girlfriend coming home early to get a quick bounce in before class started back up. We were giddy with excitement, but even then, we could tell something was different right away. There wasn't any of the excited whispering in the hall or the frantic energy to get naked once the door closed. All the action sounded heavy, irritated. We kept listening, just staring into each other's eyes, waiting to find out what the hell was going on. Then they started arguing. Something had happened during their first Valentine's Day together, apparently, on their first visit back at someone's house, and now they were mad at one another. That was at least the vibe that I got. Before long, they started arguing and nitpicking. It was such a change in demeanor from what we were used to. Then, the screaming started, the slamming around. Finally, they started fighting for real. Tim and I didn't know what to do. Clearly, this guy had no clue that we were here. Neither of us were particularly good friends with him, but at this point, something needed to happen. The fighting escalated from screaming to throwing one another around, until finally, there was a big thump and then a gurgling. Tim and I jumped up to our feet, sprinting into the hall and through the guy's door. Thank God it wasn't locked, because when we got in there, he was choking his girlfriend up against the wall. The same wall that I shared with him, and the same wall I'd been listening through for 4 months. I shouted for him to stop and that we were going to call the police, but Tim went berserk. He speared this guy in a flying tackle and smashed him into the desk. At this point, the girl collapsed onto the floor and tried crawling over to me. I got her up and led her to my room, then went back to join the fray. Just in time, too. That guy had gotten out from under Tim and was starting to get the best of him. I jumped on his back, tied his arms up, and pulled him onto the floor. By then, Tim was back on top of him. We didn't kick his ass or anything, we just subdued him the best we could until we could get the police here. They hauled that guy off, and we didn't really see him again. We saw the girl around campus, but I don't think she really remembered us. They were both almost blackout drunk when that happened, which was a contributing factor to the violence. That girl finished the semester and switched schools. The guy spent at least 1 night behind bars and, I think, ended up on probation. I, on the other hand, stopped eavesdropping and developed some much more healthy hobbies. Still, if Tim and I hadn't been chronic weirdos that semester, we may not have been around to save that poor girl. I think I speak for everyone when I say that wasn't the Valentine's Day that any of us had in mind. I'm a female in my mid-40s. I live alone in a very rural area on an island in the middle of Puget Sound. It's a 30-minute drive to the nearest grocery store, an hour away from the largest city. The island is made up of all evergreen trees and surrounded by water. It's secluded but beautiful. My house is situated on a tall bluff overlooking a tiny inlet. It's just a short jaunt through the forest down to a sandy beach where my kayaks are stored on a slip. I just need to pull them off the slip and over the sea wall, and I'm on the water. There came a time when I found myself newly single. My last long-term relationship collapsed when I discovered he had had several other romantic interests. Apparently, his business trips weren't all business. He moved out and I attempted to move on. I had some friends encouraging me to put myself out there. "You'll feel better about yourself," they said. It was well-intended advice. I knew what they were getting at. If I started dating again, I wouldn't feel like this forlorn, broken-hearted woman about to celebrate the 20th anniversary of her 25th birthday. I started dating again, hoping I would feel attractive and desirable. But how exactly could you start dating when you live in the middle of nowhere? A coworker pointed out that no one really meets organically anymore. Everything's done online nowadays. Tinder, Plenty of Fish, Bumble, OkCupid. So I went about setting up online profiles, and it wasn't long before I was overwhelmed with messages. The flings did happen. On one hand, the new relationship energy I experienced was a good distraction. On the other hand, I found myself making comparisons between these new guys and my ex. Often, the comparisons were positive. This guy always asked me about my day, while my ex rarely did. Sometimes, though, the comparisons were more about the things I missed. He doesn't hold the doors open for me like my ex used to, or his hand doesn't fit into mine the way my ex's did. They made me realize I had just jumped back into the dating pool too quickly. All these mental comparisons were a sign that I was still longing for the relationship I once had. I wasn't ready for anything new just yet, so I decided to focus on myself, which is what I should have done from the start. I hiked all over the island, kayaked, trained my brilliant mini Aussie to use these talking buttons, and poured myself into my career. I even rescued a kitten that had been thrown from the window of a moving SUV right in front of me. To this day, my Aussie loves her kitty brother. They're still the best of friends. I bought a bright pink suitcase and traveled everywhere. I learned to shoot a recurve bow. I did all kinds of things I wanted to do, but had put them off for some reason or another. Almost 2 years had passed, and now I very rarely thought about my ex. If I did, it was with an apathetic nature. That's when I knew I was ready to embrace someone new. So I logged on to my dating apps once more. It wasn't long after that I received a message from a seemingly handsome and intelligent lawyer. He lived in a larger city about an hour and a half from me. We messaged back and forth on the app for a few weeks, getting to know one another. Thus far, he hadn't set off any red flags, and I was hopeful. Finally, he asked me to invite him over to my place. Nope, red flag number one. I wasn't about to be in the middle of nowhere with someone who was still a stranger to me, and I'm sure he didn't suggest coming over just to hold hands. I told him I didn't know him well enough to have him over, and he told me he understood. Then he invited me to dinner and offered to let me pick the restaurant. I was hesitant. I was still contemplating red flag number one. Did I really want to commit to spending an entire evening with this guy, especially after he insinuated he was after more than dinner? Then again, he might not have been after anything but holding hands, right? He didn't outright say he wanted to roll around in the sheets. He was quick to understand when I said no to him coming over. But dinner? What if I got creepy vibes after just a few minutes? I suggested we meet for drinks first at the bar of one of my favorite Japanese steakhouse restaurants. It was about equal travel distance for us. I said if things went well, I would agree to stay on for dinner too. He said that sounded great, and we planned a day and time to meet. We continued messaging one another throughout the week, and I found myself liking him more and more. We seemed to have a lot of common interests, and the previous red flag was all but forgotten. The day of our scheduled date finally arrived, and I debated on what to wear. I finally settled on a black blouse with a ruffled front, fitted blue jeans, and black boots. I curled my hair, put on a little makeup, and nervously started my hour-long drive to the restaurant. I intentionally arrived early, ordered a drink, and sat where I could see the entrance doors to the restaurant. I was the only one in the bar. Here's where I need to explain that I'm not really much of a drinker. I'll do it socially on occasion, but I don't do it that often. So I was slowly sipping on my drink. I wasn't in a hurry to finish it. Besides, I still had an hour-long drive home ahead of me, so I wasn't trying to get tipsy. He walked in right on time and, surprisingly, looked exactly like his profile pictures. He was the epitome of tall, dark, and handsome, and I was already smitten. I watched as he approached the hostess station and explained he was meeting someone in the bar. She motioned over to me, and I smiled, giving a small wave. He sauntered over to where I was sitting and took the chair across from me. He smiled and exclaimed, "Wow, you're even more beautiful than your profile pictures." Then he looked down and saw the amaretto sour sitting right in front of me, and a slight frown creased his brow. "You already ordered a drink?" "Yep, I started without you, so you better catch up," I said with a smile. "Is that a challenge?" he asked, flagging over the bartender. As we sat there, our conversation flowed easily. He was intelligent and charming. I realized I had interpreted the first red flag incorrectly and wanted to spend more time getting to know him better. By the time we finished our drinks, he suggested we have the hostess seat us for dinner, and I was all in. To set the scene for you, this was a hibachi grill restaurant. If you've ever been to one, picture a large rectangular stainless steel grill surrounded on all three sides by seating. On each of the shorter two sides, there are 3 seats, and directly in front of the grill, there are 6 seats. It's considered communal style eating, meaning you are seated next to complete strangers. When the hostess sat us down, there were only 2 seats left on that particular grill. One on the end of a short side that was directly adjacent to the end seat on the long side. Instead of sitting shoulder to shoulder, we were sitting at the corner of the rectangle, with me seated on the short side, him on the long side. My left knee was almost touching his right knee. It was ideal because we didn't have to turn to talk to one another. However, it left me with a stranger on my right side, and he had a stranger on his left side. If you're at all extroverted, communal dining can be a really fun experience where you can meet new people and participate in interesting conversations. If you're introverted, you can just ignore everyone around you and pretend you're dining alone. I'm not extroverted, but I also don't mind communal dining experiences, especially when they involve good food. Our waiter came over to take our drink orders, and Lawyer Man quite boldly attempted to order another alcoholic beverage for me. "Oh, no, thank you," I said, glancing back and forth between him and the waiter. "I'll just have water. I still have to drive home." That same frown from earlier now crossed his face again. Very curtly, he said, "We're going to be here for a while yet. You can have one more." He looked up at the waiter. "She'll have another, what are you drinking again?" "An amaretto sour." But he cut me off, practically barking at the waiter. "Just bring her another amaretto sour." I was stunned into silence, and so was everyone seated around us. This was red flag number 2. For the first time that evening, he turned his phone over, looked at it, then he typed something. I assumed he was just responding or sending a text. He flipped it upside down and set it back down on the table. He smiled again, then asked me what I was going to eat for dinner. It was almost like he just pushed play again because everyone around us breathed a collective sigh of relief and went back to what they were doing. I was still stuck on pause, though. It took me a long moment to respond to his question because a huge part of me wanted to say nothing, put down my menu, and get up and walk away. But I didn't do that. The hungry part of me wanted to stay for the food. So I finally answered, I think I'm going to have the hibachi filet." Just like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, he returned to his previous charming self. He was attentive and caring. He kept pointing out the artwork painted on the walls. I turned around to look, but I didn't find it nearly as interesting as he did. I was still stuck on that red flag number 2, so our conversation didn't flow as easily as before. There were a lot of lulls in between, which gave him an opportunity to keep looking at his cell phone. He made sure to keep it angled away from me, and it occupied more and more of his time. This was red flag number 3. At one point, the man seated on the other side of him glanced at his cell phone screen, and I'll never forget the look on his face. It was a combination of shock and disgust. He quickly turned to the woman he was with and whispered something in her ear. Then she looked shocked as well. Although I was privy to this, my date was completely oblivious as he busily sent another message. I asked him, "Is everything okay?" "Totally fine. Just a case I'm working on. Boring stuff," he said. "You're not drinking your drink," I noted. "I am. Just slowly." Red flag number 4. Why did he want me to drink this drink so badly? We alternated between stilted conversation and this new obsession with the cell phone until our chef arrived to cook and serve our food. He'd never been to a hibachi restaurant before, so he was enamored with the entire process. The chef twirled around his spatula, tossed an egg into the air, and caught it in his hat. He created a volcano on the grill with the onion slices and cooked our food to perfection. My date actually left his phone face down on the table this entire time as we started to eat. However, he was back on the phone off and on. The guy seated next to him glanced at the phone screen again, then whispered to his date. His date looked up at me, clearly wanting to say something but couldn't. I figured he was probably back on the dating app, messaging someone else, and that probably looked scandalous to them. For all they knew, we were married and he was just some cheating bastard. But it didn't matter. I remained fixated on red flag number 2. This would be our last date. I knew I didn't want to see him again after tonight. As everyone at the table was in some stage of finishing their meal, he removed the napkin from his lap and set it out on his plate, pushing back his chair. "I'm going to the restroom. When I get back, I'll make sure you finish that drink," he said. Before I could protest, the couple seated next to him looked over at me. Their eyes were wide as saucers. They turned their attention to him walking away, and when they were sure he was out of earshot, the girl turned to her partner and shakily uttered, "You don't tell her, I will." He nodded with a deep sigh, then turned to me, matter-of-factly. "First off, we think he spiked your drink with something. When you kept turning around to look at the art, it looked like he kept putting something in your drink. He was definitely messing with it, so don't drink that. Secondly, he's texting someone. Another guy, I think." "What? Another guy?" I was so confused. "I think he's trying to drug you so him and this other guy could do awful things to you. He's saying stuff like, we can tie her up and take turns with her. And the other guy is saying, let's use her up before we get rid of her. I don't know, but I think maybe you need to leave before he gets back here." The girl then anxiously stammered, "It's too late. Here he comes." I swiveled around in my seat just in time to see him quickly stride over and take his seat between us again. "Now," he announces as he sat back down, "about that drink." I had difficulty looking at him. I shared one glance with the couple, then forced myself to make eye contact with them as I stood and grabbed my purse. I know, I need to finish it. I will, I promise. But it's my turn to use the bathroom now. I'll be back in a few minutes, and then you can watch me finish my drink. I'm pretty sure my voice cracked, but even if it did, he didn't seem to notice. I turned and started walking toward the restrooms before he could even respond. As luck would have it, the restrooms were located directly next to the entrance door. which also happened to be the same doors you exit. I turned down a corridor, silently thanking my good fortune that he wouldn't be able to see me actually leaving. I marched right past the bathrooms and out the restaurant doors into the frigid night air. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my car door and got inside, immediately locking the door behind me. Somehow, I anticipated him running after me, trying to chase me down in the parking lot. But that didn't happen. I started the car, almost hyperventilating, as I exited the parking lot. I gulped in deep breaths for air, holding each one in my pounding chest before slowly exhaling. I frantically checked my rearview mirror. No one. No charming, handsome psychopath. Just me in traffic. About 20 minutes into my drive, I received the first message. "Are you okay? I'm worried about you." A few minutes later, "Did you fall in? In all seriousness, please tell me if I can help you in any way." Then, a few minutes after that, "I just had the hostess go check on you. She said there's no one in there. You left. What the hell are you doing?" As more and more texts came through, I silently cursed myself for not having blocked him on the app before I left. I debated pulling over just to do that, but I wanted to get home to put more distance between me and that would-be maniac. I was still shaking so badly, despite having the seat warmers on and heat blasting in my car. As I stopped at the gate entrance to my house, I pushed the remote button to the gate and watched it roll open. My thoughts then drifted back to my ex, whom I haven't even considered in cons. I silently thanked him for the sense of paranoia that had driven me to install a private gate in the middle of nowhere. I never did give this guy any direct information about where I lived, but even still, living on a gated property made me feel a little better. I parked in my driveway and practically ran from my car inside my house. I secured the lock and deadbolt, looking out of my living room window into the darkness of the forest, which filled me with a sense of dread. So I just headed upstairs. It was then that I looked at my phone. There were 17 more messages, all of them filled with hate and vile language. I quickly took screenshots of all of our conversations and his angry messages, then blocked him. But that wasn't enough. I also deleted my account on the app, and then all of the other apps too, because I didn't want him to be able to run across me on another platform. I debated calling the police, but didn't have any proof. I'm sure the restaurant had thrown away my drink long ago. I didn't get any of the other couple's information, and I didn't actually see the texts myself. But then I thought, what if my story is familiar? Or what if he's done this before? Who do I report it to? Not my sheriff's department, but maybe his city's. But what if he doesn't really live in the city that he says he does? I finally decided to report it to the non-emergency line of the city, where we'd eaten dinner. I honestly thought nothing would come of my report, but I'd done my due diligence. I didn't feel safe for a long time after that, especially at night. The blue herons arrived that spring, building their nests in the tall pine trees on the bluff. They call out in the deep, mournful sounds, and I still feel occasional chills when I think back to that night. Talk about one twisted and crazy Valentine's Day. And that, dear listeners, brings a close to these true Valentine's horror stories. I would like to take a moment and acknowledge the rest of the members of Back to Ashes, along with the newbies. Thank you all so much for your continued support. For without you, I don't have a voice, and there would not be a Back to Ashes. I appreciate you in more ways that I can't even put into words. Thank you. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you comfortably. If you're awake, I hope you've enjoyed these collections. Until next time, please take care of yourselves. I'll be reading to you soon. Have yourself a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. Peace, love, and light to you all.